Welcome everybody to another episode of Freethinkers Anonymous. This is Mike with a co-host Jeremy and our special guest Marvin. And this week we're going to be discussing outsourcing.
Things that have been affecting the industry for a while. Outsourcing and globalization. The big thing with outsourcing and globalization is that a lot of VFX studios have now set up sister companies out in primarily Asia, but it is kind of all over the world, even in Canada and South America, particularly around Brazil. There's a lot of different studios that are setting up satellite locations and or also hiring studios that are set up in those areas. Translates to VFX workers that are making enough to survive in LA, having to compete with VFX workers that only have to survive in rural China or rural India, where they can get by on a few dollars a day. They can get by on a $2 to $3 an hour. That's enough for somebody in Asia. That's not enough for somebody in the US, especially for a particularly complicated set of skills that VFX workers have to develop that require both a mathematical mind and a artistic mind. Then this is exacerbated on smaller projects through websites that allow people to hire outsourced workers. Upwork, Behance, Fiverr, Mandy, all examples of this. There are some benefits. I mean, you can potentially find a little work on those websites when you're between studio gigs. You could potentially find a company that when you find that gig, you do such a good job that they continue to bring you on over time. You can also see the trends in the industry, but you kind of got to take it with a grain of salt because you're seeing rates that are being averaged between North American rates, European rates, with Asian rates, which are generally going to be significantly lower. So something to keep in mind when you're working through those for any VFX artists. The minuses are significantly bigger. Finding a good client is like finding your soulmate on a dating app. It's hard to find the general quality of people that you find on these websites that are trying to hire is about the same as the people that you find on dating apps. You can get lucky. You can find someone that's really awesome. You can find a client that is really awesome through these websites. But the chances are extremely slim, and the vast majority of what you're going to find is somebody that has no idea what the VFX industry is like, that significantly undervalues the work that goes into it, that has not prepared anything for you in the way that it would need to be prepared on set, which makes your job significantly harder, that doesn't even know how to communicate about their needs. So it's a lot of like guess and check information when you're trying to work with somebody that you find on these apps, where generally speaking, you're going to be doing a lot more work than you would otherwise need to. You might not be making significantly more money. You might not be making any more money on the project because sometimes it is a per project transaction. It's not an hourly transaction. So you jump in thinking like, oh, I can probably knock this out in 2 or 3 days. As soon as you open up the footage, you're like, oh, this is going to take weeks. But you've already agreed to do it. You've already agreed to do it for a specific amount. That's why I don't do that. I only work on an hourly rate unless I know exactly what needs to be done. Because I'm not working for $2 worth of pay for 2 weeks worth of work. I've done that multiple times in the past. Never again. Globalization has also plummeted rates. They've removed worker protections and they have ballooned the workforce because now we have India and China who have similar populations to the US that have much lower cost of living. So you have a lot of people that are looking for work. There's not enough work to be found. So where are they going to go for work? Internationally, which means they have to look for digital work, like visual effects work. And there's a lot of them because there's so few international laws when it comes to worker protections. Good luck making sure that US workers are still valued in any way, shape, or form. But the one primary way that US workers still kind of are able to make it through is because they are very talented in relation to some of the vast majority of workers in Asia primarily. That's not to say that there's not really, really talented workers in Asia, but personally, I think the average for American workers is going to be at 7 to an 8, and the average in for Asian workers, particularly in India, China, and Korea, is going to be much lower. It's going to be like a five, maybe a four. But again, there are artists in those nations that can blow American workers out of the water, pretty much every single American worker out of the water because they are so talented. Some of the problems, anyone can post a gig. So you can easily run into a client who won't pay you at all and you have no recourse. If you don't have their information, if you don't have contract with them, if both of you are not in the US, good luck finding a lawyer that can convince them to pay you what they owe you. That also means you have a lot of people who have no knowledge of the value of the VFX skill set. So sometimes they'll be like, hey, can you do this $500 worth of work? I'm going to pay you $75 for it. They don't know that the work is going to take $500 worth of work. They just know what they think is fair. So think about like hiring an electrician or a plumber and how much you think things are going to cost. And then when they send you a bill, it's going to be more because skilled labor takes a lot more than people generally think. Same with finding a photographer for a wedding. People are like, hey, can I find a photographer for like 800 bucks? No, you can't. Not for a professional. It's going to cost more than that because there's a lot more that goes into wedding photography than just showing up on the day, taking some pictures, and sending you the files. So, just like VFX, it takes a lot more work than you might otherwise think. Also, a lot more infrastructure as far as having a computer that can actually handle the software, having licenses for the software. We're actually allowed to work because almost all the software that VFX artists use is a subscription base, which means the longer we have it, the more we pay for it. And there's very few uh, alternatives for that. It also encourages the workforce to stay as individuals or extremely small teams, which limits our bargaining power in the industry. One of the reasons why unions haven't really taken off is because there's so many studios that are so small. And then there's the giant studios that have all the power. And even the studios that have all the power don't really have that much power because at they're still beholden to the big six, which again I'll get into a bit. Also, any shady practice from VFX workers that might save money or time is exploited by the scabs on the site. Unethically sourced AI image generation tools, just agreeing to do a job if they pay half up front and then they pay half and then you disappear. All of those things happen for the clients just as much as for the workers. So it is very hard to find a good situation on these websites where you're actually getting what you're looking for and there's good communication back and forth. There's also, when it comes to AI and VR, there's a lot of people that claim to be experts. And because the VR industry is still relatively new and AI is very new, you have a lot of people claiming to be experts that have no idea what they're talking about. They don't understand how the tools work. They basically jumped on it and for a day or a week tested it out and they said, hey, I got this in the bag. I know how to do pretty much everything. And they might have never worked in the industry outside of that. And you're hiring them for $500, $1,000 to do some work. And they may or may not. You never know. And with outsourcing, I do think there's a benefit to outsourcing some work or hiring individuals overseas. It's not all bad. Roto work, for instance, which is the process of roto or rotoscoping, is the process of outlining an object or person for a certain duration throughout footage. You might need to roto someone to isolate them from the background so that something appears behind them instead of in front of them if it's placed on top. You might need to do it to have an effect only affect them. There's a number of reasons why you might need to roto someone, and it's not particularly a creative process. You can use intelligence and creativity to speed up the work. The work itself is just, is it done? Do the edges line up with the edge of the object or the person, or do they not? So, since it's very cut and dry, you can send it overseas. And if it's not done correctly, you don't pay them. If it's done correctly, you pay them. And it's a very simple process. You can also find really talented individual artists overseas. I think I've already mentioned this, that there are some artists overseas that blow American artists out of the water. I personally have hired a number of artists overseas in India, in Ukraine, Russian artists, artists in Portugal, in South America. They can be extremely, extremely talented. And if you only look in the US, you're not going to find them there. You might be able to find artists that are on the same level, but I would definitely not discount overseas artists as a potential if you're looking to hire for a VFX project. It also provides an avenue for work and escape for individual artists stuck in war-torn, famine-stricken, or poverty-stricken regions of the world. There's a lot of artists that are in South and Central America. There's a lot of artists that are around Russia and or were in Russia, and also artists that are in or around the Middle East, Afghanistan, that are dealing with a dangerous situation for their families and for themselves, and they're trying to get out of it. And one of the benefits to our work is that it can be remote. So, not that it's exactly a charity, but prioritizing those artists when they are good fits for the project is a humanitarian aspect to hiring artists that are overseas in these more dangerous areas. If you can find someone that can get the work done, that you're giving them an opportunity to leave a dangerous situation as opposed to somebody that they could use the work, but their lives aren't going to fall apart. They don't get the work. They might just have to find other work that's nearby. So, something to think about again for individuals who are hiring or considering hiring or even not considering hiring somebody overseas. One of the things that's kind of driven people to be overseas is tax incentives. It is very much driving work out of the country, particularly to Vancouver and Toronto, on top of overseas, where artists and low-level supervisors are effectively shipped out of the country. Top-level management, they get to stay where they are. They just keep their offices in LA and they get to keep living their lives the way they want to live them. But the artists that are actually doing the work and the lower level supervisors that are making sure the work is good by the time it gets to the top level supervisors and business leaders, those are the people that are like, you know what? No, you got to pick up your entire lives. You have to go to a different country. And we might provide a little bit of support on that, but probably not. And if you don't, then you lose your job. I've been at multiple studios that have done this, where if I didn't agree to move out of the country, then I would have been fired. And I didn't agree to move out of the country. So I was laid off as opposed to fired, I guess, but semantics. There's also tax incentives that are driving artists outside of the LA area. I'm sure we'll talk about this more on the state of LA, but Los Angeles's tax incentives, particularly for post production, are almost non existent. Atlanta and Austin and even New York City are significantly more supportive cities to pull artists into. Georgia, as an entire state, is really good when it comes to providing incentive for visual effects, post production, and production work to be done in the state. Now, the focus for all of those are primarily on production, not post production, but wherever the production work is, post production companies are going to find it much easier to find work if you're near where production is happening, because all of your work is modifying or plussing or adding to what was shot on set, unless you are a standalone CG animation studio. So being near where the work that you can pull from is done is going to help. Cool. So that's globalization.
A coworker I had who worked at an outsourced company in Hong Kong, and his experience working at a Chinese studio. When he was there, he found it really difficult because he couldn't really kind of tell them what to do, you know? Even though you come in as a supervisor, you're there to kind of oversee and kind of guide the artists and make sure they're doing the job right. They logged everything that they had to do. So any notes, any assignments was all logged. I believe he said it was on like a whiteboard or like one of those boards where you just pin things to the wall. And he said that's how they kept track of everything. They didn't do any emails. They didn't, there was no like we call it like shot grid, like a program where you keep track of assignments for different people to do. And you check off if it's approved, if it's in progress, if it needs to be assigned out. They keep track of everything on this board and people will walk in and out and keep track of things on the board. And he wanted to push really hard for them to use a program And they said no. This is how we do things here at the studio. You're a foreigner. You're trying to come in and tell us what to do. No, I'm not going to do that. So that was one story I heard of how it can be working with outsourced companies because at the end of the day, it's more of a sister company. It's not really an extension of the actual studio. It's more so a studio in another country that they just work with. So yeah, dude, I don't know how much you wanted to say about your personal experience of what you may have heard or know about the whole outsourcing situation.
I mean, it's pretty crazy. I have talked to some people that went out to India to oversee or supervise for different studios, and they've had some pretty bad experiences. First off, the place or the area that they stay in wasn't as luxurious or anything, but also just the back and forth of trying to work with some of the artists because saying they have one way of doing it, hesitant to kind of change or modify. But when I went out there, it was a similar case with some artists or like the group of artists where they had their own way of doing things, and we were trying to get them to follow the pipeline we were doing out here. Yeah, it was a whole back and forth. And in the beginning, we also had our own more tedious way of tracking shots. There was pretty much like storyboarding, but with all the shots that we had and complexity, and we're trying to figure out, give it out to the artist until eventually, yeah, we got into more like software using to manage all that. Yeah, overall it was a great experience in some ways. In other ways, you kind of just your eyes get open to a lot of things that are different in regards to, like, say maybe the pay, right? The differences of why studios would kind of do the outsourcing. And I think maybe, either you or Jeremy had maybe mentioned of how many artists from outsourcing that you can kind of hire to the ratio of, like, in the US. And yeah, it's pretty much kind of like that where, you can kind of hire 10 artists in whatever outsource facility to one artist here in the US, especially if, I think over there they were working salary wise, they would get paid salary per month. And then depending on, like, if they worked the weekends, they would get an extra bump. But they were also work crazy hours. There was like at least 12 hours up to 16 hours like every day for pretty low salary.
You can average 8 day and then it's overtime past that.
No, it was a salary. Like, so we had the quota, right? The way it was working, they had a quota every week that they had to hit as like the department. And usually if they were able to get what they needed during the week, they had weekends off.
Oh,
Yeah, sometimes they didn't hit quota, they would have to work the weekend to try to hit that quota. But when we started getting more projects, they started hiring more people, quota started going higher and higher. So then, they were working a lot of hours, but there wasn't really any OT that I can remember because it was per month salary. Whatever they got, they got. And then eventually, I think they started implementing, if you reach quota or you have the option to work the weekend, it was kind of like an incentive, right? Like, oh, if you do what you're supposed to, you can kind of get a little extra on the weekend if you chose to. Obviously, that wouldn't fly out here. Hour wise, I think a lot of artists would get per hour or whatever. There's at least overtime and stuff like that. But eventually, there was two different shifts, or like a night shift, day shift. And they would just kind of swap. They were trying to have a cap of hours work, but it was still a lot. It was pretty crazy.
yeah, it's pretty wild too, because I remember someone told me they didn't really fire artists over there. That pretty much if someone wasn't doing a good job, they would just put them back in training. And then after a month or two of training, or they would just switch them to a different department to see if they did better under another team or doing a different type of assignment. But yeah, I remember hearing that more so would just opt for them to just leave on their own. And then, sometimes there'll be another studio that may open down the street and then like a bunch of people would leave. And that would be their relief of hopefully getting rid of artists that weren't good.
It's interesting because when a lot more work was coming around, they were trying to get as much outsourced as they could, and they were just doing like mass hirings. There were some artists that were barely out of school or even still in school or maybe not even attended school for this, kind of like self-taught. They were just bringing people on. They just needed to fill seats. So they went through training. And yeah, there were times where, if someone wasn't quite as fast or not quality, or they weren't really meeting quota, that eventually they would get sent back to training. They would have kind of a probation period kind of thing. Even if they did well, eventually sometimes they would kind of fall off again and get sent back to training. And there were some that ended up shifting to a different department, and heard that sometimes they ended up doing really well or about the same. So it was actually pretty hard from what I've heard and experienced over there to get fired. they needed the artists. And yeah, like you said, especially if another studio had a facility that was close by or around and everyone jumped ship to that studio, they definitely couldn't afford to fire artists. They needed more artists. So the growth of, some of these studios, it's pretty wild with how much they need.
Yeah, I can only imagine, man. Because I remember, I think at capacity where we were, it was like a few hundred. And then I could only imagine over there. Yeah, because a lot of what we do sometimes just needs a lot of manual labor. I know Jeremy mentioned before, like Roto will eventually be something that may be obsolete in terms of needing a whole flood of artists. But for the meantime, you need, cutting people out of an image or a video. It takes a long time. And, we did a lot of Roto, and I don't want to do a whole segment on that, which is boring, but some of the stuff that we do is very tedious and it requires a lot of man hours to do. Yeah, even today, man, even with clothes, all this modern day technology, there's still people making clothes by hand. And it takes dozens of man hours to make shoes and clothes. Some of that just stuff just won't change, as much as we want to pretend that, oh, it's the year 2024, whatever that's supposed to mean. We come along the way, but in some ways, like things still take a long time. All right, I think we're going to leave it there for this week. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and be sure to check out the next one.